Blush by Jamie Brenner. To make a great wine, a winemaker has to put all at risk and walk a fine line between complexity and spoilage. Louisa Thomas Hargrave, The Vineyard. 1. New York City. I'm looking for something decadent, the woman said, leaning over the counter and squinting at the menu board. Something to impress. She was not one of Lee's regular customers, the ones who stopped in every week to buy cheese for their weekend charcuterie boards or just to stock their fridge. Those people Lee had come to know over the years as they debated the merits of tossing a good Castorasso into salad instead of feta. "Are you looking for a soft or hard cheese?" Lee asked. Typically, she would ask for more information, what other food would be served. If wine would be part of the meal, what varietal? But lately, she was distracted. Either one, the woman said. She had brown hair shimmering with gold highlights and wore a chic, lightweight trench coat. "I'm a big fan of the Kunik," Lee said. "It's a triple cream cheese. Very silky texture and truly delicious. Try this like butter," she said, passing the woman a sample of the soft white cheese. The woman tasted it, and her eyes widened. "You know what you're talking about." Yes, she did. Lee had opened the cheese shop 18 years earlier, when her daughter was just 3 years old. The small space on the corner of 79th Street and First Avenue had stood vacant for a long time. Every day, passing it on her way to buy groceries at Agata and Valentina, she fantasized about turning it into a cheese shop. She even had a name for it, Bailey's Blue, an ode to her love of blue cheese. The door opened, and this time it was a regular, a party planner named Roy Lout who had talked more than one hostess into using Bailey's Blue instead of a larger purveyor. "I like your style," she had declared, and Lee knew she wasn't talking about her clothes. Years earlier, before it was popular, Lee had made a commitment to feature locally produced cheese, and her shop consistently showcased northeastern artisanal varieties. There had been a time when she thought about expanding her space to include the location next door, if it became available. She taught wine and cheese classes in the cramped back room of the shop, and she could use a dedicated space for that. At just around 800 square feet, Bailey's Blue had one long counter and one display case filled with wheels of creamy brie, camembert, comte, and gruyere. She also had one case for her beloved blues, Roquefort, Stilton, Gorgonzola, a few wedges of the classic Maytag, Perchever Blue from Illinois, and Bergier Blue from upstate. The shelves behind the counter brimmed with jars of assorted olives, figs, chocolate-covered almonds, artisanal crackers, and jam, the accoutrements to tease out the nuanced flavors of fine cheese. Her husband had recently added a mounted display of cheese knives and serving boards for sale. "It's getting cluttered in here," she'd said. But Stephen, recently retired and now working beside her in the shop, was eager to make his mark. As it turned out, there would be no expanding next door. The landlord was selling the entire lot to developers, and they would be losing their lease in 6 months. It was happening all over the Upper East Side neighborhood known as Yorkville, once a haven of mom-and-pop bakeries, hardware stores, boutique pharmacies, and beauty shops. Now entire city blocks were being razed to build high-rises, the small businesses replaced by CVS and Citibank. Stephen saw it as an opportunity to start fresh with a bigger, better space. "Change can be a good thing," he said. Lee, who had been in business for nearly 2 decades, felt like maybe she needed a moment to catch her breath. "Congrats," Roy Lout said. "I read your daughter's story. To be published in the New Yorker before she even graduates college? She's a genius." A genius who had not answered any of Lee's texts or calls for the past few days. "Thank you," Lee said, brushing the concern about Sadie out of her mind. "And I think you'll love this Hudson River Valley Blue. It's mellow, but you notice a bit of tanginess." Roya slipped the sample into her mouth. She said. "There are some tropical fruit notes in here. Right?" Stephen walked in, his arms laden with shopping bags. He gave the customers a nod of greeting before joining Lee behind the counter. "Mission accomplished," he said, unpacking the special cheese wrapping paper and bags from Formaticum she'd run out of. Her delivery wasn't due until tomorrow, so Stephen had made a trip to Brooklyn. She smiled at him. Stephen Bailey was tall and lean, his thick dark hair threaded with silver. His intense eyes appeared green-gray, except in the sun, when she could see they were, in fact, blue. He was as handsome as he had been the day she first saw him. She had been fresh out of college, working behind a counter at the legendary shop Murray's Cheese in the Village, where Stephen was the assistant manager. It was supposed to be just a summer job, a last hurrah in the city, before she returned to the Hollander Winery to take her place in the family business alongside her father. It hadn't worked out that way. Another customer appeared in the doorway, and Roya and the trenchcoat woman had to squeeze in to make room. "Good morning, Mrs. Fryer," Lee said. The woman had lived in the neighborhood for 60 years and had been widowed for half of that time. She kept busy with her 4 Dachshunds and local gossip. "Tell me it isn't true," Mrs. Fryer said. "What isn't true?" Roya asked. "I'm going to take the Kunuk and the Brie," said the trenchcoat woman. Lee nudged Stephen out of the way so she could reach into the cheese case. The place really was not big enough for the two of them. "She's closing the shop," Mrs. Fryer announced to the whole store. "No one's closing anything," Stephen said. "Who are you?" Mrs. Fryer asked. Stephen and Lee exchanged a look. She shrugged. "I'm Lee's husband, Stephen. We met last week." "Well, you can't fool me, husband. The landlord sold to developers. This entire block is going. They're putting up a big condo." Outside, Mrs. Fryer's leash dogs began to bark. "I'll be back this afternoon for my Gouda." The door stuck as she left, and warm air wafted in. The trenchcoat woman reached to close it. When she paid for her cheese, she handed Lee a business card. "My name's Anouk Jansen, I'm a real estate agent." "Anouk. What a lovely name." "Swedish," Lee said. "Dutch. If you're looking for a new retail space, feel free to be in touch." "We're definitely looking for a new space," Stephen said, taking the card from Lee. "At some point," Lee said, shooting him a look. Everything was moving way too fast. A few months earlier, in a corporate restructuring, Stephen's company had offered senior management, including members of the in-house legal team, the option to take a package and retire early. Stephen had jumped at the chance. He'd never enjoyed being an attorney. It had always been a means to an end, supporting his family. But now that Sadie had only 1 year left of college, the pressure was off. Lee had fully supported his decision. The truth was, she was ready for a change too. She'd become tired of running the shop. She'd lost the spark. Yes, she still loved cheese, and maybe she would still try to teach. But she'd had enough of the day-to-day running of the business, the payroll for her part-timers, the politics of the New York City Department of Health, the vendors, her landlord. But when she admitted to Stephen that she wasn't planning on reopening, he had other ideas. "I'll help you. I'll have so much free time. We can run it together. It can be our cheese shop." Lee had been shocked by the suggestion. And not in a good way. Growing up, she'd seen her parents navigate working together, and it had been fraught. "Someone has to be the boss," her mother had once said to her. Maybe she could discuss it with her mother next week. She and Stephen would be vacationing at the vineyard, where Lee had grown up. Stephen opened the register and folded in some receipts. "Do you need help with the class tonight?" he said. "No, thanks, I've got it." He turned to the shelves, rearranging jars that were already exactly how she wanted them. She looked away, willing herself not to ask him to stop. She loved her husband. But all of this togetherness was an adjustment. It would get easier, she hoped. 2. Upstate New York. "I can't believe you didn't even pack yet," Sadie Bailey's boyfriend said. He sat at the small wooden desk next to her bed, waiting for her to finish, half-heartedly tossing clothes into an overnight bag. He had every reason to be impatient. After all, they were supposed to already be on the road to his parents' beach house on Cape Cod. "Almost done," she said, glancing up but avoiding eye contact. Behind him was a poster of Sadie's favorite Virginia Woolf quote, "Who shall measure the heat and violence of the poet's heart when caught entangled in a woman's body? What does that even mean?" Holden had once asked. They had so little in common. And yet she'd found Holden Dilworth irresistible, with his golden boy good looks and boundless energy. By day he was captain of the crew team. By night he was a beer-chugging partier. Sadie had been smitten the moment she spotted him at the dining hall. Holden had blonde hair and brown eyes. He had flawless skin and teeth that had never needed braces. He very much resembled Kristoff from Frozen, though a tad less burly. Sadie, on the other hand, did not resemble a Disney princess. She might be cast in a movie about a family's perilous flight from the Ukraine in the 1800s, which was something that had actually occurred in her ancestry. Sadie had curly dark hair and brown eyes, and was not tall. She did, however, have her mother's dramatic eyelashes and a version of her father's high cheekbones, as well as an aquiline nose that she felt gave her face a certain strength of character. Holden initially found her seriousness and intellectualism intriguing. But now reality was catching up to them. Holden complained about how much time she spent reading and writing. He complained that Sadie was never willing to be spontaneous. Things had worked when crew was in season. They made time for each other in the margins of their first priorities. This always felt like an appropriate balance to Sadie. She never considered it a sacrifice to write instead of hanging out with Holden. And she thought Holden felt the same way about her own schedule until crew ended, finals finished, and he announced that they finally had time to really hang out. It wasn't that she didn't want to spend time with him. But apparently the only thing Sadie knew how to be truly devoted to was her writing. Sadie closed the overnight bag. "I need to talk to you." She beckoned Holden over to the twin bed in the corner. They sat facing each other. He shook a lock of hair out of his eyes, even blonder now after a month or so of sunshine. "Look, I'm sorry I'm distracted. I just met with Dr. Moore. Can we not, for one weekend, talk about Dr. Moore or your thesis?" Sadie immediately felt defensive. The only reason she was at that particular school was Dr. Moore. Sadie had applied to only one college. It was a decision that mystified her parents and high school advisors alike. It was not the most prominent school, certainly not as prominent as, say, Harvard or Princeton. It was not the most beautiful campus, certainly not as beautiful as, say, Vassar. But the college had one thing that no other school had: English professor Rahita Moore. Sadie had first met Dr. Moore when she was a junior in high school and had won a spot at Young Arts, a prestigious national arts competition. The essay she'd written had been part poetry, part treatise on the objectification of adolescent girls in popular culture. Young Arts flew her down to Miami, where she had room and board for a week to spend with other high school artists, writers, ballet dancers, playwrights, actors, and to study under mentors who were professionals in their field of interest. One of Sadie's mentors had been Dr. Moore, a groundbreaking music journalist who had also published several volumes of award-winning short fiction. Now she was her academic advisor, and Sadie had planned to spend the summer working as her research assistant. She'd never been more excited about anything in her life. The fact that she had just been published in The New Yorker, the magazine that published her literary idol Susan Sontag, paled when compared to the anticipation of working with Dr. Moore for the next few months. Holden would never understand, but there was no place she would rather be, even on a flawless spring afternoon, than inside the Redbrook Colonial building that was home to the English department. Somehow it smelled of musty library books, even though it didn't actually house a book collection. An hour earlier, Dr. Moore had welcomed her into her office looking uncharacteristically somber. In hindsight, Sadie should have known something was up by the lack of Dr. Moore's usual warm smile. Dr. Moore stood and closed the office door. She wore one of her signature jewel-toned dresses that complemented her dark skin and large brown eyes. She had close-cropped hair, and the only jewelry she wore was medium-sized gold hoop earrings. A striking woman, she wore her beauty effortlessly because she knew her looks were only her second-best asset. The thing Sadie liked the most about college was the way it felt to be surrounded by brilliant women. In high school, she'd read the book Steal Like an Artist, and it said, if you were the smartest person in the room, you were in the wrong room. Well, for the first time in a long time, she felt like she was in the right room. Dr. Moore resumed her seat and leaned forward at her desk, looking at Sadie with a direct gaze. Sadie, you continue to miss all the key deadlines for your thesis. Well, not all of them. Exactly. She had been admitted to the university's honors English program, a track that would enable her to take master's-level classes during her senior year. To graduate with the honors degree, she would spend her senior year writing her thesis. The outline had been due the week before finals, and she still had not handed it in. The shameful truth was, she still couldn't quite home in on the right angle for her paper. It should have been easy. The subject of her thesis was her favorite writer, Susan Sontag. She'd originally intended to examine two works, Sontag's Illness as Metaphor and her seminal 1964 essay Notes on Camp. She had thought her passion for Sontag's work would be enough to sustain her through the rigors of developing a thesis. Apparently, it wasn't. I'm a little behind, but I have my topic now, Sadie said. Detachment as methodology in the works of Susan Sontag. You were supposed to have finalized your topic months ago. You should have an outline already. I can catch up. Dr. Moore clasped her hands together and leaned forward on the desk. Sadie, I can't in good conscience keep you on as my research assistant. Even if I wanted to overlook the fact that your status in the honors program is in jeopardy, a prerequisite for the research position, you need to focus on your academics. Sadie crossed her arms, hugging herself. I just need a little more time. Can we talk after the weekend? Sadie, this isn't something that can be figured out in one weekend. Nor should it be. I want you to give this some thought. Some thought? All she'd been doing was thinking about it. She was exhausted. I don't know what's wrong with me, she said quietly. Nothing's wrong with you. This is exactly how you should feel. I'm supposed to feel like I'm failing? No. But this is meant to be a challenge. Have you ever felt challenged before? Of course, she said. But inside, the answer was a stunning no. She'd never thought of it that way before. She'd always worked hard, but writing short stories felt natural to her, like flexing a muscle that ached to be stretched. Writing this paper, based on research and a sort of rigid academic logic she wasn't accustomed to, was like she was asking her body to lift 2 tons. Sadie, the purpose of this time of your life is to push yourself. Get out of your comfort zone. Dig deep. Dig deep? Sadie's ideas were subterranean. There was nowhere deeper to go. So no, she wasn't in the mood to spend the weekend at the beach meeting Holden's family. She looked up at him. The truth is, Dr. Moore fired me from my research position. I have to get back on track. I mean, maybe I wouldn't be off track if I wasn't going out all the time. Going out all the time? You're a 21-year-old hermit. What was he talking about? She went out. Sometimes. Not everyone could keep up with his drinking. Look, I'm not outdoorsy like you. I didn't grow up in Connecticut. What's that supposed to mean? Holden said. Sadie was not a beach person. She didn't want to lie down and glorify dirt. She didn't want to walk barefoot and step on creatures. She didn't want to deal with plastic bags packed with moldering food. Holden didn't wait for her response. Sadie, I'm sorry about the gig with Dr. Moore. But you have all summer to figure this out. Let's get on the road. He walked over to her dresser and pulled out some clothes, tossing them into the half-packed bag. No more excuses. We're going to have a great time. My parents and sisters can't wait to meet you. Sadie wanted to meet them too. She wanted to meet his mother, Catherine, his dad, Douglas, and his sisters, Lily and June. She wished she were the type of person who could run around with the sunny blonde Dilworth family, clamming and sailing, and doing whatever it was normal people did on a summer weekend. But she had to work. Surely, Holden would understand that. You're asking me to choose between you and my work. Holden tossed his car keys from hand to hand, impatient. Are you coming or not? When Sadie didn't move, Holden kicked the desk chair. She flinched. So that's it? Holden said. You know, it's one thing to work all the time, to never be spontaneous. There it was again. She wasn't spontaneous enough. But now you're just bailing for no reason. It's bullshit. I'm sorry, Sadie said. This is over. Holden headed for the door, but then stopped and turned around. One more thing, don't be sorry for me. I feel sorry for you. You think you're living some big life of the mind. But you're not living at all. 3. Sometimes Vivian Hollander wondered if her husband was testing her. At the very least, he was trying her patience. But after 50 years together, she could never stay angry for long. And at that particular moment, she couldn't let her irritation show at all. She was surrounded by customers on the vineyard's back deck, a 4,000 square foot space the family called the veranda. Lots of groups of women in sundresses, open-toed shoes, jumpsuits, aviator sunglasses. Men in cargo shorts and baseball hats. People were out to have a good time. Her employees, wearing dark blue t-shirts that read Hollander Estates Vineyard on the front and family-owned since 1971 on the back, poured glasses of wine at the long bar. The veranda offered a perfect view of the vineyard. From her vantage point it was just endless green fields. Not a single house could be seen in the distance, and never would be. Decades earlier, her husband had sold the development rights of all their acreage to the county as protected farmland. The sun was shining, and a breeze blew off the nearby Peconic Bay. The North Fork of Long Island had roughly 34,000 acres of active farmland, but was also a peninsula framed by the Long Island Sound, the Peconic, and Gardiner's Bay. The terrain and climate offered unique and uniquely challenging conditions for founding a winery. And no one had done it before Vivian and her husband, Leonard. In recent decades, dozens of new wineries had followed the path she and Leonard had forged. Today, other North Fork wineries might have flashier ads or trendier packaging, but one thing Hollander Estates had was legendary status. They were the first, they were the original, and plenty of customers, not all, but enough, knew that a conversation with Vivian Hollander was worth every penny they paid for their glass of Chardonnay or case of Cabernet Franc. Vivian made daily appearances in the tasting room and on the veranda. Her primary role had become that of the winery's glamorous figurehead. But she still had opinions, and that was why, when one of their employees made a beeline for her, explaining that there was no one in the office to sign for the new labels, she was disconcerted. New labels? I tried to find Mr. Hollander, the employee said. But he's not answering his phone. Vivian didn't bother asking why he didn't try to find Asher. No doubt their son, the vice president of Hollander Estates, was on one of his endless lunch breaks. She looked out at the vineyard and spotted her husband walking among the vines in the distance. If there's no one to sign for the labels, just let them be returned, she said. The employee shuffled back to the office, and she made her way down the veranda steps to the grass. Shielding her face from the sun with her hand, she walked through the rows and rows of leafy plants tied with trellis wire, just the smallest green berries beginning to appear. Leonard, as always, was lost in his own world. His love of the vines perhaps rivaled even his love for her. When he finally noticed her, his hooded dark eyes lit up. Okay, so maybe his love of the vines didn't compare to his feelings for her. No, she could never stay angry for long. And yet, Leonard, you aren't changing the labels on any of the bottles, are you? Vivian hadn't been involved with the day-to-day running of the business for many years now. In the early days, she'd done everything from weeding the crops to knocking on restaurant doors to, yes, designing the labels. They were eggshell colored with a parchment edge and midnight blue lettering, elegant and timeless. Why mess with them? It had to be their son's misguided idea. Asher suggested it was time for a change. I'm giving it a try, Leonard said. Why on earth would you do that? To encourage his involvement, Vivian. You know I've been asking him to contribute more. Well, let him contribute in some other way, Vivian said, distracted by a text from her head of housekeeping. There's a problem with one of the guest suites. Vivian could not imagine what that problem might be, but with her daughter arriving in 2 days for a long overdue visit, she couldn't take any chances. Every summer, she counted the days until her daughter arrived with her family. She wished Lee visited more often, really, she wished she'd never left. But she couldn't blame her for creating a new life for herself in Manhattan. Not after the way Leonard had handled things. I need to get back to the house. Leonard, promise me, don't change the labels. He leaned forward and kissed her on the cheek. He smelled like fresh-cut grass and the sweet apple shampoo he used of hers, while complaining it was too girly. The trellised stone path from the winery to the main house was worn and familiar to Vivian. She had walked back and forth under the pergola, with its winding vines of roses and wisteria, for nearly 50 years. The sight of the mansion still surprised her sometimes. When she had first set eyes on the house as a young newlywed, it had been a humble, rambling 300-year-old farmhouse befitting the potato fields it had once stood upon. Over the decades, as the winery flourished, the house had evolved to the chateau-esque wonder that had landed it on the cover of more than one architectural magazine. But in her mind's eye, it was still the home of her early marriage, the days when she woke at 6 in the morning to start pruning vines. It was the land that had created their fortune, but lately, it was the house that made her feel rooted in her own life. Vivian took a shortcut to one of the side entrances. The red Italian slate was hot under her feet. She could feel it through the thin soles of her ballerina slippers. She still wasn't used to wearing flats, but she had finally made peace with the fact that at her age, she could no longer spend every day in heels. It didn't matter that some customers somehow felt no hesitation in showing up to the tasting room wearing shorts and sneakers. Vivian still valued decorum. As soon as the house came into view, she saw a flash of movement, a figure walking toward the hedgerow and disappearing from sight. If it weren't for the hair, she might have missed it. But that hair. Bridget Muldoon had first appeared in her son's life last August, the latest in a seemingly endless parade of vacuous young women, none of whom he ever seemed inclined to settle down with. Not that Vivian wanted him to settle down with any of them. Admittedly, since Asher was almost 50, this did not reflect positively on his judgment or life choices. But he was her son, and Vivian worried about him. Bridget was 28 years old, with long auburn hair the shade of a purebred Irish setter. Asher marveled over the color, as if it were a miracle of nature, despite the brown roots that appeared once a month. She took the winding back stairs to the third floor, where the guest suites, formerly her children's bedrooms, were located. Only one of them was still occupied, Asher's. He'd never moved out, and Leonard didn't mind, because he was always on call to help with the business. She passed a sitting room, a decorative ottoman, a reading room, and continued down a long hallway to the bedrooms. In here, Mrs. Hollander, the housekeeper said, leading her to the ensuite bathroom of Lee's childhood bedroom. Vivian and Leonard entertained a few times a year, and during some of their more extravagant weekends, their visitors stayed overnight. But Lee's room had not been occupied since their New Year's weekend celebration, when the governor of New York stayed with his wife. "Oh, my good Lord," Vivian said. The bathroom was all white marble and custom millwork, with an antique cherrywood framed mirror mounted above the vanity. The white monogrammed towels hanging on the nickel bars were the first hint that something was amiss. They were all smudged with lipstick and streaked with peachabage face makeup. The vanity was covered with jars of moisturizer, lipsticks, bottles of nail polish. A hairdryer was left plugged into the wall. The trash bin overflowed with tissues and round cotton discs also bright with makeup. Dirty clothes were piled in one corner. What on earth was Bridget doing in this bathroom? If she was sleeping in Asher's room, why not choose that bathroom? Clearly, she'd decided to use this room as her dressing space. "Please, just throw all of this away," Vivian said. "Salvage whatever towels you can clean. And the rest, just dispose of those as well." "Throw it away? The makeup and hair dryer too?" "Yes. This is a trespass. Total disrespect for this home. And lock the door behind you." She took a deep breath. In just a few short days, Lee would be in this space. For now, Vivian would forget about Asher and his ill-mannered girlfriend. She wouldn't worry about labels or changes or anything else. She wanted to focus on the positive. Her daughter was coming home. 4. Lee spotted the distinctive turrets of her childhood home rising in the distance and felt a flutter of excitement. As Stephen navigated the road, she opened the passenger window, inhaling the briny air, as though it were the first time she'd breathed in months. The winding drive leading to the house was lined with towering, densely leafed European hornbeam trees. The surrounding acreage was abundant with wild lavender, an apple orchard, and formal English flower gardens. Vivian, with her affinity for English gardens, spent years planting flower beds and trees to cultivate a showcase garden. The apple trees had also been a pet project. It had taken 6 years for the first Cortland apple tree to bear fruit, And that first apple was treated like gold. A familiar face greeted them inside the house. Lee embraced the family chef, Petronelle, hugging her fiercely. "Dinner's on the veranda, you're late." "Hurry, hurry." Petronelle had been with the family for as long as Lee could remember. She was British, round-faced, with pink skin that barely seemed to age and pale blue eyes. The only sign that Petronelle was older now than she was in Lee's memory was her hair, which was white instead of its former brown. Some of Lee's most vivid memories were of Petronelle cooking her breakfast, a special concoction she'd called eggy toast, French bread with a hole torn in the middle, an egg cracked in the center, and cooked in a frying pan. By the next day, they would be on winery time. Awake with the chirping of the birds, early morning strolls out in the fields, late afternoon Chardonnay in the tasting room, followed by dinner on the veranda. Only 80 miles from Manhattan, but a world away. "We're barely 10 minutes later than we told them we'd be." "I built in time," Stephen said. Still, they rushed to the winery's back deck, which overlooked the vineyard. During the day, it served as an extension of the tasting room. On weekends, it was often reserved for weddings. At night, it was one of the family's favorite spots for dinner, overlooking the endless greenery of the vineyard. "There she is," her mother called out, standing from her seat at one end of the table long enough to seat 20. It was their picnic table, made of planked cherrywood. Tonight, it was set for 6, with a crisp white runner down the center, cobalt blue wine goblets, and bunches of blue hydrangeas and coral tea roses in short Murano glass vases. Lee knew that inside the house she would find every room filled with flowers. As a girl, Lee had taken the simple elegance of life at the estate for granted. During the week, there were 3 formal meals a day. Vivian maintained a chef's garden, and every morning after breakfast Petronelle would pick vegetables in thyme, basil, rosemary, or mint for that evening's dinner preparation. Her parents had hosted lavish parties nearly every weekend. She would watch them plunk fresh strawberries from the garden into flutes of sparkling white wine, her mother dressed in halston or ungaro, with a wildflower tucked behind one ear. Tonight, her mother looked beautiful as always, her carefully maintained silver blonde hair coiffed and just reaching her shoulders. She wore a white linen dress and ropes of black pearls around her neck. Her manicured nails, kept short enough to be functional, were a glossy coral that matched her lipstick. Beside her, her father poured a glass of red wine. He wore a powder blue polo shirt and his usual khakis, his white hair striking against his tan. While he had once been handsome in a young Marlon Brando sort of way, now his features appeared blunt and almost brutish in his creased face. But his intense dark eyes flashed with brilliant intensity, and when he gave a rare smile of approval, it had the force of a stadium light. He waved them over, and Lee could tell by the set of his jaw that he was annoyed by their late arrival. Lee had learned, by following her mother's example, not to get caught up in her father's moods. Across from them, on the opposite side of the table, was her brother, Asher. Looking at Asher was like looking at a male version of herself. She and Asher had their father's dark coloring. In the summer, they tanned no matter how much they hid under hats and used sunblock. It was their Sephardic roots, Argentina via Ukraine via someplace long forgotten. Now in his late 40s, Asher still had the youthful appearance of a much younger man. They had their shared forebears to thank for good skin and thick hair. Next to him, a pretty redhead wearing a low-cut halter top. Ah, yes, the girlfriend du jour Bridget. "I'm so sorry we're late." "The traffic," Lee said, kissing her mother and father and taking a seat next to her brother. Asher raised his hand for her to high-five him. "Hello." Stephen shook her father's hand and kissed her mother on the cheek, gestures that reflected relationships, that had mellowed into mutual respect after some rocky early years. "I was just telling your mother to start without you, but she wouldn't hear of it," her father said, summoning one of the food servers, who appeared with trays of cucumber cups stuffed with crab meat and seared scallops. "Do we have salad?" "Bridget's not eating fish," Asher said. "I thought you're pescatarian," Vivian said. Then, to Lee, "Have you met Bridget?" "No, I haven't." Lee smiled at the young woman. The very young woman. When would her brother grow up? Her father stood and uncorked a fresh bottle of wine. "We're having steak for the main course, so I'm going to recommend the Cabernet." Cabernet Sauvignon was one of the grapes her parents had their earliest success growing. The fruit had thick skins and the vines were hardy, so the climate was not an issue. It was one of the first grapes her father taught her about when she was a girl. It was the world's most widely planted grape, but it hadn't even existed before the 1600s, when it was produced by a cross between Cabernet Franc and Sauvignon Blanc. "Nothing against the Cabernet, Dad, but a glass of rose would be perfect right now," Lee said. Like a lot of their friends, she and Stephen had fallen into the habit of drinking the crisp, pale wine all summer. "This winery will make rose over my dead body," her father said. "You know how I feel about trendy wine. Fads come and fads go, but quality is forever." She knew, and yet she couldn't help but prod him to change his mind. "Dad, come on. Rose isn't a fad. Last summer the Hamptons literally ran out of it, people were drinking so much. That's a red flag. One year the vineyards can't produce enough, then the next year you get stuck with stock you can't move. I've seen it happen." She let the subject drop. It wasn't her business. It wasn't her problem. He'd made that clear a long time ago. Growing up, she believed the winery would be her life's work. After graduating Bernard with a business degree, she'd been prepared to return to Hollander Estates and work alongside her father. With her brother disinterested in the winery, she was the heir apparent. Apparent, that was, to everyone but Leonard. The wine industry was rife with sexism. Her father, a vintner who learned how to cultivate grapes from his immigrant father, believed that a winery was a man's world. When Lee realized the full implications of this, it had been painful, so painful it had taken her a few years before she could visit the vineyard. By that time, she had met Stephen and had a demanding job in Manhattan, working for the legendary cheese purveyor Murray's. She rationalized that things had happened for a reason. If she had stayed on the North Fork, she wouldn't have met Stephen. "Fine. I'll have the Viognier," she said. She would never understand her father. He refused to produce rose, and yet he devoted time and energy to Viognier, a very old, difficult varietal to grow. He'd told her once that the rough translation of Viognier was the road to hell. But oh, how it paid off. Every season, Hollander's light white wine, with its notes of jasmine and white peach, was her favorite. When the vintage was most fresh, it was so clear it almost looked like water. As the months passed, the color deepened and the flavor changed. That was the amazing thing about wine. It was never one thing. It had a life cycle. "The Viognier is too light to pair with the meat," her father said. "Leonard, indulge us." "We're Philistines," Stephen said. There was the slightest edge to his voice, just enough for Lee to notice. To be fair, she had no one to blame but herself for his cynicism about her parents. When she and Stephen first met, her feeling of betrayal at being turned away from the family business had still been fresh. As they began dating, the portrait she'd painted of her family over long walks and dinners had not been flattering. Stung by her father's refusal to bring her into the family business, she told Stephen how she had been turned away, unfairly disregarded, because she was a woman. By the time Stephen finally got to know her parents, It was too late for him to form objective opinions about them. He saw them as selfish people who had turned away the woman he loved from her birthright. When they married, one of his vows had been, "I promise to put you first. To create a family where you never feel shut out or second place. You will always be my priority, Lee." When the wine was poured, Leonard stood and raised his glass. A toast to the start of the summer season. It was his traditional toast every year at that time. To the start of the summer season, everyone echoed. Lee sipped her wine, relishing the familiar notes. She might have left the wine business, but, as she often told the customers who crowded in the back room of Bailey's Blue for her classes, cheese and wine had one very important thing in common: both were made with the philosophy of terroir, or the taste of a place. And this wine tasted like home. Vivian launched into an anecdote from the previous weekend about a limo full of bachelorettes who showed up for a wine tasting already drunk. "We need to ban limos," her father said. "Oh, that's no fun," said Bridget. Lee looked at her and smiled. She had a vivacious energy about her, and it was clear she wasn't at all intimidated by Leonard and Vivian. "It's getting out of control," said Vivian, ignoring her. "These young kids." "Speaking of kids, where is my granddaughter?" "Mom, I told you. She has a job at school. As a research assistant. She couldn't take a few days off." "It's a prestigious position," Lee said. "You know how seriously she takes everything. Her grandparents would like a visit." "That's something to take seriously," Leonard said. Lee and Stephen exchanged a glance. Her father had always been gruff, and he certainly wasn't mellowing with age. But Leonard, like a lot of brilliant, successful men, was given a lot of latitude. He commanded respect. Even when she was irritated by him, she had to admit she also worshipped him. He had been her first teacher in life, and her most important one. Nothing she learned in college or in running her own business could overshadow the lessons learned growing up with Leonard Hollander. "So how's the cheese biz?" Asher said. "Business is booming," Stephen said. "Oh, yeah, you two are working together now," Asher said. "I forgot." "How wonderful," Vivian said, smiling first at Lee and Stephen, and then at her husband. "Working together has been such a rewarding part of our life together." Lee shifted uncomfortably. She turned to her brother. "So, how did you two meet?" Asher and Bridget exchanged a look, that intimate look between a new couple, as if they were the only two people in the world who had ever met and fallen in love. Lee remembered bringing Stephen to the estate for the first time, sitting in that very spot. "I was sailing with my buddies out of Sag Harbor," Asher said. "I was working on the boat," Bridget added, smiling at him. "It was this epic, 63-foot catamaran. My friends and I were kicking back, having some drinks. I asked for a bottle of champagne. And then this vision appears holding an ice bucket. I said to myself, before we reach dry land, I'm getting her number." "Before we reached land? You got my number before I even uncorked the bottle." Someone's phone beeped, then beeped again. "Whose phone is that?" "No phones at the table," Leonard said. It was a policy he adhered to himself, even though running the winery was a 24/7 job. "Sorry." "My bad," Bridget said. Then, to Asher, "I posted that thing, and my phone is, like, blowing up." Lee glanced across the table at her mother, her face framed by the verdant greenery in the background. But Vivian was distracted, looking in the direction of the house. Her face broke into a smile. "Oh, Lee. You fooled me. Sadie is here after all." 5. The bedroom furniture had been replaced since the days of Lee's childhood. A king-size bed instead of a queen, muted wallpaper instead of the lavender she'd insisted on as a teenager, museum-quality paintings on the walls instead of her Madonna posters. But while the decor had been updated long ago, in her mind's eye, it was still 1988. Stephen turned on the TV, a news channel. She slipped into the bathroom, brushed her teeth, and changed into a well-worn tank top and loose, cotton night shorts. When she was growing up, her mother had always worn fancy nightgowns, peignoirs, she called them. Vivian Hollander would never dream of wearing a t-shirt to bed. Lee didn't hold herself to that kind of standard, but in Bessemer she did like to find cute things at the Gap body store on Lower Fifth Avenue. She returned to the bedroom, where Stephen was unpacking his clothes. "What do you think about Sadie showing up like that?" he said. "I'm thrilled, obviously. But I have to wonder if something's going on with her." It was so unlike Sadie to be spontaneous. When she explained her sudden appearance by saying that she just couldn't miss the family vacation, Vivian had nodded approvingly. But Lee and Stephen had exchanged a look. Sadie had been too busy to answer their calls for days, and suddenly she felt compelled to run out to the vineyard. "Your mother kept asking me if you and Sadie planned the surprise all along," Stephen said, closing a set of drawers and putting his empty suitcase into a closet. Lee was one of the few among her friends who didn't have reason to complain about her husband being a slob. She climbed into bed. "Why would we do that?" He shrugged. "You know your mother loves to make things dramatic." "Oh, she doesn't. Come on. Did you notice that she barely spoke to your brother's girlfriend the entire dinner?" Lee sighed. "Yeah. I'm sure she'll have plenty to say to me about her tomorrow when we're alone." Stephen slipped into his side of the bed. Lee gave him a smile before he turned out his light. She felt a slight pang, very slight, when she thought about how their first night of vacation used to end. The tank top she'd just put on would quickly be coming off. But it had been a while since going to bed together meant anything more than going to sleep. The worst part of this was that she didn't mind. There had been a time when Stephen's touch could have made the entire world recede. Her love for Stephen had been so strong it had overwhelmed her at times. Their attraction had been like a force, a storm that overtook her, and she hadn't had to think about responding to him any more than she had to think about breathing. The first night she gave in to her feelings for Stephen, it had been a co-worker's birthday. After the last shift at Murray's Cheese, a bunch of them went to a bar on West 14th Street. This was before the meatpacking district had been turned into a glittering outdoor mall. The streets were desolate, some of the butcher shops still in operation by day, but dark and secured with pull-down grates at night. Rumor had it that the bar they were going to, the Cooler, had until just recently been a meat storage facility. The Cooler was dark and crowded, with raucous live music and a red cast to the lighting that gave her a headache. She sipped her beer and stayed longer than she otherwise would have because she happened to have a huge crush on the cheese shop's assistant manager, Stephen Bailey. She had a weakness for men with light eyes and dark hair, that striking combination known as Black Irish. Stephen was reserved and kind, even when someone messed up by not letting the cheese rise to room temperature or missed a shift. Plus, he was working his way through Columbia law, so she had a lot of respect for him. Or maybe it was just the eyes. Either way, by midnight, even the pull of Stephen Bailey's charms couldn't keep her at the loud bar another minute. She said her goodbyes, and surprisingly, he offered to walk her out. Standing on the corner of 9th Avenue, she said, "Okay, well, see you Monday." He just stood there, looking at her in a way that made her stomach do a little flip. "I'll walk you to the subway." "It's pretty late," he said after a moment. A group walked by laughing and debating the merits of two nearby bars. Stephen watched them pass and said, "Look at the type of shady characters this neighborhood attracts. It's really not safe." She laughed. I'm not taking the subway. I live on Bank Street. After she'd graduated college and discovered that she wouldn't be returning to the North Fork after all, she'd rented an apartment in a West Village brownstone, a fifth-floor walk-up that she shared with a roommate she'd found through a service. It was run by a man working out of a shoebox of an office in Chelsea. He had chain-smoked and shuffled through 3x5 cards like a matchmaker from the old country, but he did find her someone compatible. Kara worked in fashion and traveled constantly. She and Lee had barely exchanged more than a few sentences in the entire year they lived together. They kept track of whose turn it was to buy toilet paper or clean the kitchen by a magnetic whiteboard on the refrigerator. Sometimes Kara's exclamation points could feel a little passive-aggressive, and Lee looked forward to being able to afford her own place. Her parents had offered to help with her rent, but out of pride she'd refused. "I'm taking the 6, so bank is on my way," Steven said. "Unless you really don't want company." Again, their eyes met. "Company would be great," she said softly. To this day she remembered the details of that walk. Stopping at the Korean deli on the corner of 14th and 8th, now the site of a high-rise condo, for a bottle of water, and the way it smelled like grease from the hot buffet. If she'd been alone, she would have gotten a container of fried rice. When they reached her building, a long-haired tabby cat occupied the top step, and when they walked up, it jumped to the adjacent garbage bins. She couldn't recall what they talked about, but she could still feel the tension as she turned the key in the front door. The brownstone had double doors, the first a heavyweight wrought iron. Steven helped her pull it open, and in the time it took for her to unlock the second door, she'd decided to invite him in. Still, she made a show of acting like this was in no way a romantic overture, trying to act casual as she stopped in the mail room and collected her bills out of the small square door in the row of a dozen other square metal doors. She had closed and locked the door with her tiny mail key when she felt his hand on her back, gentle, an almost imperceptible touch. When she turned, the intensity in his eyes gave her butterflies. "He's going to kiss me," she thought. But he hesitated, and so she took one step forward, tilting her face toward him. He pressed against her, moving her back flat against the wall of mailboxes, his mouth meeting hers. In the morning, she would look in the mirror and find marks where the metal had bit into her shoulder blades. But in the moment, all she felt was the soft pressure of his lips, the coolness of his hand slipping under her light jacket, the hammering of her own heart. Somehow, they made their way upstairs, into her bed. A little voice in her head asked her if she really wanted to sleep with someone she worked with on the first date. Not even a date. But that voice was no match for the overwhelming drive she felt to be naked and against him and touched by him. He peeled off her clothes so slowly, it was as if he was giving himself a chance to reconsider. In fact, he murmured at one point, "Is this a good idea?" Her answer was tugging off her underwear and unzipping his jeans. His body was chiseled and taut, and she ran her hands over it with unabashed admiration. She had slept with only 2 other men, and neither had inspired such fervor. After a short while, a switch seemed to flip within Steven, and any hint of hesitation was gone. His mouth was on her neck, her breasts, and when he touched her between her legs, her stomach fluttered like she was looking over a ledge. When he moved inside her, she felt, yes, this is it. She was 23 years old and finally experiencing the delirious heights of sexual ecstasy. Her body had a mind of its own, and that night, it spoke in a language she'd never heard before, but in which she became fluent over the decades. But lately, for the past year or so, it seemed they'd somehow fallen into the friend zone. They still enjoyed each other's company. They talked and laughed and kissed and hugged. But sex? She had no interest. and he barely seemed to have more than she did. Or maybe it was her own lack of enthusiasm that had dampened his. Either way, it was concerning. Stephen gave her a peck on the cheek and was snoring lightly before she'd even adjusted her pillow. Lee turned off her bedside light. She would be awake for hours